but I just watched a video. It is midnight. I just finished a workout and something clicked. I watched a video that made something else click that I watched earlier today, and that's this. The kid calls for a tow. The woman, Vicky, calls the captain to do the tow. And she says, this kid's grandfather, this Jerry Ackerman, is a member. Before she says the guy's name, the captain says, Jerry? I just got off the phone with him. I literally just got off the phone with him. And he said that they don't need a tow, that they're fine. So, hold on. The grandson is calling for the tow simultaneous to the grandfather calling the captain of the towboat saying they don't need a tow before the captain gets a call from Vicky. When did the kid call the grandfather? While the boat is sinking? He called grandfather for what could grandfather possibly do for you? He called the grandfather for advice. What the fuck do we do? This kid's dead. Grandfather said, you gotta make a fucking trail. That you tried to get help. There was an accident. Something happened. The boat's going under. Okay, it's a boat. Call. So there is a recording of you trying to get help for something. And we'll figure it out later. I think that their story has evolved. But that was what the grandfather thought of then, to create a timestamp in history of what was happening, what they were doing, where they were, and that there was a completely different emergency happening, nothing to do with Nolan, okay? And the grandfather did not want to get billed for this tow, and obviously didn't want the captain to go and happen upon whatever the fuck's going on, so he preempts the emergency call to the captain and says, hey, you might get a call, but they don't need it. I walked them through it. It's fine. It was an alibi advised by the grandfather. You remember the Murdoch documentary series? You remember that, right? You remember when his son killed a girl in a boating accident, right? And how they completely jumped into action immediately without skipping a fucking beat to do a cover-up. They all get back, they all wipe all of, in unison, all wipe their social media. Why would you have to do that? Well, why the fuck would you have to do that? If you left him on the island, why are you deleting all of your social media? Another thing.
I couldn't imagine that they want to get underage drinking on camera. So what they had articulated to me, that it wasn't abnormal for people not to snap and not to do a lot of pictures and things like that, because they were focused on being
told me
off of the
they
mainland.
showed you pictures and videos.
Yeah,
so
but
they
it's
did
not
take
uploaded.
Pictures and videos.
No. It's not a lot of pictures, and they weren't uploaded.
Shut the fuck up, Brandon, because he is spinning his wheels here, trying to convince Nancy that the boys were telling the truth. They let me see their videos on their phones. And that, of course, they wouldn't want to film themselves drinking. They all film themselves drinking. No, but they wouldn't upload it onto Snap. Here's why he just fucked up. The mother, one of the first days after this all happened, the mother said, we wanted his phone because he had snapped, and we wanted to see the snaps that he had snapped, and the snaps were deleted. So she had seen his snaps. The whole point of Snapchat is that you are able to post things that maybe you don't want a record of, but at least everyone knew you were having fun. The stuff deletes. You know if someone screenshots it. So he had absolutely snapped. They wanted to go into his phone, into his account, because you can see your historic snaps, and those were gone.
I was about to say, he was the peacemaker of our friend group. I mean, anytime anybody had beef over somebody, over a girl or whatever, he would go over there and start talking to him. He's like, man, I think this guy's actually pretty cool. Yeah, this guy's I don't think cool. I think we should become friends with this guy. Yeah. And lo and behold, we would somehow become friends with the dude, even though he's getting with one of our other buddies' exes or whatever. But yeah, he was.
If your son goes out on a boat, especially with a group of black kids, and doesn't come back, but they all come back safely, and then those people lawyer up, they deactivate their social media accounts, and they say that your son did not bring his cell phone with him. You know, like, would that make sense to you? It doesn't. Logically, it doesn't make sense, right?
But I believe one took a polygraph, and from what was told to me, that they all passed.
Nancy, my clients have not taken a polygraph test.
Excuse me. Everybody is now pointing out that Charles and TMZ are now backpedaling on everything they said, because Charles was recently being interviewed, and I think it was by Don Lemon, and he's like, yeah, it's odd that they're going off on Officer Race Batum Tatum's podcast. It's odd that they did this. It's odd that they did that. But TMZ, you have been the ones supporting these young men's PR crusade this entire time. So why now are you finally flip-flopping? Is it because all of the backlash you've been getting for reporting on this so incorrectly and favoring one side over the other? Because every time Harvey was on there, he said, oh yeah, we've corroborated the footage with them on the CTO call. And then when Trent Out Loud, shout out to my man's his Trent Out Loud said, where is the metadata? Where is the META? Where is the META, son? We need to see it all day, son. Where is it? Where's the metadata? And Harvey's like, oh yeah, we just believe them. So I'm glad TMZ is backpedaling, but you guys should have been on this from day one, because one thing about TMZ, we all respected you on that celebrity tip.
No, he wouldn't. Nolan always stays in touch. That's Christine Wansley, talking about her son on national television, answering a question no mother should ever have to answer, because 6 weeks earlier, on the 4th of July, 18-year-old Nolan Wells went out on a boat with a group of friends to a sandbar off the Mississippi coast called Horn Island. The boat came back that afternoon. Nolan didn't. 2 days later, a National Park Service ranger found his body washed up on the island's northwest tip. Here's what makes this case different from the 100 other tragic drownings that happen on American coastlines every summer. 6 weeks in, nobody, not the sheriff's department, not the state medical examiner, not the family's own forensic pathologist, has been able to say how Nolan Wells died. 2 autopsies, both inconclusive. A grand jury has now been convened, even though no one has announced that a crime occurred at all. And this week, as Nolan should have been turning 19, his family and the local district attorney are locked in a public dispute over something as basic as who gets to look at his phone. Tonight, we're not going to tell you Nolan Wells was murdered. Nobody credible has proven that, and we're not going to pretend otherwise for the sake of a better story. What we are going to do is walk through exactly what's confirmed, exactly what isn't, and exactly why an entire community, and now a good chunk of the country, has stopped trusting the official version of what happened to him. Because whatever happened on that island, something about how this investigation has unfolded since has made the questions louder, not quieter. That's the story tonight. Before any of that, it's worth spending a few minutes on who Nolan actually was, because in a case like this, it gets easy to lose the person underneath the headlines. Nolan Xavier Wells was born in August 2007, raised in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, a small coastal city on the Gulf. He graduated from Ocean Springs High School in the spring of 2025 and, by the following summer, was heading into his sophomore season as a wide receiver at Southwest Mississippi Community College. Friends describe him as the kind of guy who smoothed things over rather than stirred them up. Someone who'd notice tension in a friend group and go talk to whoever was on the outs, just to bring them back in. That's not a detail investigators care about. It's a detail that matters anyway, because it's part of why the account of his final hours doesn't sit right with the people who knew him. His mother, Christine Wansley, has said publicly and repeatedly that her son wasn't the type to go quiet on people. He stayed in touch. He came home. Whatever else is contested in this case, that's the baseline his family has been working from since the night he didn't show up. This wasn't in character. That word, character, comes up constantly in this case, from people who actually knew Nolan rather than people who've only encountered him as a name in a headline. Teammates describe someone who took the sport seriously without making it his entire identity. He was, by multiple accounts, the kind of friend who showed up in small, unglamorous ways. The guy who noticed when somebody in the group had gone quiet, who'd walk over and start a conversation just to make sure nobody felt left out. It's the kind of reputation that doesn't make headlines on its own. It only becomes relevant now because it's the exact thing his family points to every time someone suggests he simply wandered off without a word. People who are described that consistently by that many separate people as someone who checks in, that's not proof of anything about how he died. But it's context that deserves to sit alongside the timeline, not get lost underneath it, because it's the reason his own mother has never accepted the simplest explanation at face value. Now the day itself, and here we're going to stick closely to what's actually been confirmed by investigators and reported by outlets that have covered this case closely, not what's been speculated about it. July 4th, 2026. Horn Island is a barrier island about 10 miles off the Mississippi Gulf Coast, a 10-mile strip of sand and scrub brush with no bridge, no ferry, no road in. The only way onto it is by private boat, which is exactly what makes it what it is, an unofficial gathering spot with no fixed address, no security cameras of its own, and no way to know exactly how many people were actually there on any given day. On a normal weekend, it's quiet. On the 4th of July, it's the opposite. One friend who was there that day described it to a national outlet simply: boats practically on top of each other, people arriving all morning, the kind of scene where you could lose track of someone for an hour without anyone thinking twice about it. That's not a detail meant to excuse anything. It's a detail that matters for understanding how something as basic as who saw who and when gets genuinely difficult to pin down after the fact, even without anyone lying. Nolan traveled out to the island that morning with a group of friends, part of a small flotilla. 3 boats total made the trip out together that day. He was last confirmed seen around 3 in the afternoon, wearing blue swim trunks and sunglasses. According to the friends who were with him, Nolan chose to stay behind on the island to talk with a young woman he'd met that day, telling them he'd make his own way back to the mainland later with another group. Around 4:30, the boat he'd ridden out on developed a mechanical problem. Reports describe an issue with the bilge pump, the system that clears water out of the hull, and the group left the island without him, headed back to shore. Here's the first real question the case turns on, and it's one that's never gone away. Why was Nolan the only person in that entire group who didn't make it back that day? The answer his friends have given, that he chose to stay, that this was his decision, not something done to him, is the account currently on record. It's also the account his mother has said, flatly, doesn't match the son she knew. That night, when Nolan still hadn't come home and hadn't been in contact, Christine reported him missing. What followed was a multi-agency search. The U.S. Coast Guard, the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, the National Park Service, and volunteer search and rescue organizations, including the United Cajun Navy, combing the island and the surrounding water for 2 full days. Anyone who's spent time on the Gulf Coast knows what that search actually involves. Shifting tides, limited visibility in the water, an island with almost no infrastructure to search from, and a search area that isn't just the 10 miles of sand, but the open water surrounding it in every direction. 2 days later, on July 6th, a National Park Service ranger discovered Nolan's body in the water just off the island's northwest shore. Dental records confirmed the identification the same day. A vice president with the United Cajun Navy, whose organization assisted the search, told reporters afterward that the body had washed back close to where Nolan was last seen, which he said suggested the currents hadn't carried him far, a detail he offered specifically to push back on online speculation that Nolan had been moved, transported, or left somewhere else entirely. It's one experienced searchers read on wind and current patterns, not a scientific conclusion, and it's worth holding as exactly that, informative, not dispositive. If you're new to this channel, we go deep on cases like this one, not to sensationalize them, but because the families deserve someone actually reading the documents instead of just repeating headlines. Hit subscribe if that's the kind of coverage you're here for, because tonight's case only gets more complicated from here. So a body was found, an identification was made, and normally, that's when a family starts getting answers. Instead, 6 weeks later, they still don't have one. 2 autopsies have now been performed on Nolan Wells, and neither has produced a determined cause or manner of death. The state's official autopsy, conducted by the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office, remains sealed, pending review by the grand jury that's now been convened in Jackson County. A sealed autopsy in an active investigation isn't automatically suspicious on its own. Prosecutors seal records for all kinds of ordinary procedural reasons. But it lands very differently in a case where the family has been asking, publicly, for basic transparency since the week their son died, and getting almost none. The family commissioned their own independent autopsy, performed by forensic pathologist Dr. Roger Mitchell, funded by former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick. Attorney Ben Crump, representing the Wells family, announced the results in late July, inconclusive, citing a lack of sufficient evidence to determine cause of death. That autopsy did note one specific physical finding: red discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of Nolan's head. Discoloration like that can indicate a range of things, from post-mortem changes to trauma, and without a completed toxicology report and a full official finding, it doesn't point definitively toward anything on its own. It's a thread, not an answer. It's worth understanding, briefly, why 2 separate pathologists, working independently, with different access, could both come back inconclusive on the same body. By the time Nolan was recovered, he'd been in Gulf water for roughly 2 days. Saltwater immersion accelerates decomposition and can obscure or mimic injury patterns that would be far easier to read on a body recovered within hours. It can also complicate toxicology, since submersion affects how alcohol and other substances distribute and break down in tissue. None of that means an accurate finding is impossible. Labs account for these variables constantly, but it explains, in a fairly mundane and non-conspiratorial way, why inconclusive isn't automatically evidence that something's being hidden. It's also why it isn't evidence that nothing happened. It's simply the honest result of a difficult case, which is a much less satisfying answer than either side of this debate wants to hear. State toxicology results have reportedly been completed, but as of this recording, have not been made public. That single detail is worth sitting with for a moment. The test that could most directly answer whether alcohol was a factor, and to what degree, exists right now, finished, in a file somewhere in Jackson County. And neither the family nor the public has been told what it says. Which brings us to the piece of this case that's dominated headlines for the past 2 weeks, Nolan's phone. Here's the situation as it's actually documented, not as it's been characterized by commentators on either side. On July 15th, 9 days after Nolan's body was found, his parents, their attorney Ben Crump, and Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath, met in person. According to correspondence later released by the family's legal team, all parties agreed at that meeting to a jointly coordinated forensic examination of Nolan's phone, to be conducted at the Digital Forensics Lab at Mississippi Gulf Coast Community College, with the possibility of FBI involvement. For nearly a month after that meeting, according to the family's attorneys, no date or time for that examination was ever actually set. Then, on August 12th, the DA's office sent a letter, not scheduling the agreed joint examination, but directing the family to simply deliver the phone to her office within roughly 48 hours, by 9 a.m. on August 14th. The problem, Nolan's parents were out of state at the time and weren't scheduled to return before that deadline. Sit with that timeline for a second, because the two sides are telling two very different stories about what it means. From the DA's perspective, and to be fair, her office has said very little publicly, citing an ethical obligation not to make statements that could compromise the grand jury process. A demand for evidence in an active death investigation is a normal, lawful step. From the family's perspective, this wasn't the process anyone had agreed to a month earlier, and the short notice landed at a moment they'd already told the DA's office they'd be unavailable. The family's legal team responded in writing on August 13th, stating plainly that Nolan's parents have not refused to cooperate, and that the correspondence itself was proof of that, pointing back to the July 15th agreement as the actual plan everyone had signed on to. They also raised a detail that matters more than it might first sound like. The two sides still haven't agreed on the actual forensic protocol. Not just when the phone gets handed over, but who has access to the extracted data once it's pulled, how chain of custody gets documented, how the evidence itself gets preserved, and when, or whether, the device gets returned to the only family that has it left of their sons. Those aren't stalling tactics. They're the standard components of any properly documented digital forensic examination, and asking for them in writing before handing over the last object your son ever touched isn't obstruction. It's precisely what you'd expect a family in this position to ask for. There's a detail buried in the family's own correspondence that's easy to miss, but worth pulling out, because it undercuts the simplest version of the uncooperative family narrative. The family's Mississippi-based attorney, Ahmad Smith, wrote directly to McElrath's office that his team had actually reached out on July 25th, 3 weeks before the disputed deadline, while traveling internationally, specifically to say they intended to reconnect on the phone examination once they returned. That's not the behavior of a family trying to run out the clock. It's a family, by their own account, trying to stay in front of a process that then went quiet on its own for the better part of a month before resurfacing as a 48-hour ultimatum. As of this week, Crump's team has told the DA's office the family's forensic experts are on standby, ready to proceed with the joint examination on any of 4 proposed dates between August 18th and 21st. The earliest window available under the 12 hours notice both sides need to assemble their experts. They've also asked McElrath's office to simply confirm whether the examination will still happen at the location originally agreed upon back in July, the forensics lab at Mississippi Gulf Coast Community College. Whether the DA's office has responded to that offer remains unclear as of this recording. It's worth being precise about why the family is drawing such a hard line on protocol instead of just handing the device over and trusting the process. A modern forensic phone extraction isn't someone scrolling through a screen. It's typically a full logical or physical extraction, a complete mirrored copy of everything on the device, recoverable deleted content included, run through forensic software that generates a unique digital fingerprint of the data at the moment it's pulled. Done properly, with both sides present and both sides walking away with an identical verified copy, it's about as airtight as evidence handling gets. Neither side has to simply trust the other's account of what the phone shows. Skip that structure, and you're left with one side controlling the only complete record of Nolan's final hours, and the other side having no way to verify it. That's the actual stake behind a dispute that, on the surface, can look like nothing more than an argument over a deadline. None of this proves anyone did anything wrong. A demand letter that lands during a family's travel could be a coincidence, or an oversight, or simply how a busy DA's office operates under a real deadline of its own. But it's the second time reporting has described something close to this exact pattern. A short-notice deadline landing while the family happens to be away, and a pattern, even an accidental one, is exactly the kind of thing that erodes trust in a case that's already short on it. This is the part of the story most coverage has either oversimplified or ignored entirely, which is exactly why we go through primary documents instead of just repeating whatever's trending. If that's useful to you, the like button actually does help more people see coverage like this instead of the louder, less careful version. Now, here's where the investigation stands on the ground. While the phone dispute has played out in public letters, the actual on-the-ground investigation has continued. The Jackson County Sheriff's Department says it has interviewed roughly 60 witnesses since Nolan's death, and the FBI has been assisting with the digital evidence side of the case. The 3 friends who traveled out to Horn Island on the boat with Nolan have reportedly been interviewed in depth by investigators. Sheriff John Ledbetter's department has also made repeated public appeals, not for tips or theories, but specifically for original, unedited photos and video taken on Horn Island that day, particularly anything from the island's northwest tip, where Nolan's body was ultimately found, and anything depicting what the department has called alleged altercations. That specific wording matters. It tells you investigators are aware of accounts describing some kind of confrontation or disturbance on the island that day, separate from Nolan's disappearance itself, and they're actively trying to run that down with actual footage rather than second-hand description. Here's the detail that's kept this case alive online for 6 weeks. Despite an island packed with boats and cell phones on one of the busiest weekends of the year, no footage has ever publicly surfaced showing any of the 3 boats that traveled to Horn Island that morning actually returning to the mainland. Departure footage exists. Return footage, as of this recording, does not, at least not that's been made public. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, somewhere in an unreleased case file. Investigators don't announce every piece of evidence they've collected, and there are ordinary explanations: a different marina, a camera with a limited field of view, footage that simply hasn't been requested from a private dock owner yet. But it's a real, confirmed gap, and 6 weeks is long enough that it's fair to keep asking about it. Before we get to the eyewitness question, it's worth tracking how the official language around this case has actually shifted over 6 weeks, because that shift is itself a kind of evidence, not of what happened to Nolan, but of how the investigation's own confidence has changed. On July 6th, the day Nolan's body was found, Sheriff John Ledbetter told reporters his detectives were interviewing people who'd had first-hand interactions with Nolan the day he went missing, and said plainly, "No foul play has been identified at this time." That's about as routine a statement as a sheriff's department makes in an early-stage investigation, not a denial that anything could be wrong, just an honest snapshot of where things stood on day 1. 6 weeks later, that snapshot hasn't been updated publicly in any meaningful way, even as the facts underneath it have kept accumulating. 60 witnesses interviewed. The FBI brought in to help with digital evidence. A state autopsy sealed pending grand jury review. A grand jury convened at all. None of that automatically means investigators now suspect foul play. A grand jury and an FBI digital forensics assist can both happen in a case that ultimately gets ruled an accident. But it does mean the case has grown substantially more complex than a same-day, no foul play identified statement, and that statement has never been revised, retracted, or updated in public, even as circumstances around it have visibly changed. That gap, between an investigation's growing complexity and its public language staying frozen at day 1, is exactly the kind of thing that reads as reassuring caution to some people and as an unaddressed contradiction to others. There's one more piece of contested evidence worth walking through carefully, because it's been treated publicly as far more solid than it actually is once you apply the standard any courtroom would apply to it. A claim that witnesses saw Nolan alive on the island later that evening, well after his friends say they left. An attorney representing some of the young people who were on that trip has publicly stated that acquaintances made a positive identification of Nolan on the island later in the day, describing them as reliable and credible. That's a serious claim, and if it holds up, it would meaningfully change the timeline this entire case has been built around. But reliable and credible is a conclusion, not a finding, and legal analysts who've reviewed the footage circulating from that claim have pointed out that it hasn't actually been tested against the standard court's use for eyewitness identification. That standard isn't complicated, and any trial attorney can walk through it from memory. How far away was the witness from the person they're identifying? What were the lighting conditions? Was anything obstructing the view? Had the witness been drinking, and how would anyone verify that either way? The footage that's circulated publicly in connection with this claim shows a single figure from behind, at a distance, with nothing more identifying than the color of a pair of shorts. Applying those standard questions to that specific piece of footage, more than one attorney who's reviewed it on air has reached the same conclusion. It's not a strong identification, and in an actual courtroom, it would be an easy target on cross-examination. That doesn't mean the sighting is false. It means the certainty attached to it publicly is running well ahead of what the underlying evidence can currently support. And it's exactly the kind of gap a full investigation, not a cable panel, is supposed to resolve. There's a dimension to this case that can't be left out, because it's shaped almost every part of the public response to it. Nolan Wells was the only black person in the friend group he traveled to Horn Island with that day. Everyone else in the group was white. That fact alone doesn't prove anything about how he died, but it's impossible to separate from why this case exploded into national news the way it did, and why the Wells family's distrust of the investigation runs as deep as it does. Mississippi's history with cases involving black victims and predominantly white communities is long and well documented, and it's the lens through which a significant part of the public and a significant part of Nolan's own community has read every delay, every sealed document, every short-notice deadline in this case. The response reflects that. NARCI President Derek Johnson publicly criticized the pace and transparency of the investigation, while also cautioning against speculating on manner of death before a full investigation is complete. Both things can be true at once. Sports commentator Stephen A. Smith raised the case on national television, framing it in terms every parent understands. You send your kid out with friends, you expect them to come home. Reverend Al Sharpton and media entrepreneur Tyler Perry have both been involved in supporting the family. Perry, reportedly covering funeral costs, drawing on his own experience, losing a family member in unclear circumstances and having to fight for answers. The Mississippi chapter of the NARC echoed the family's call for a fuller investigation, pointing specifically to what it described as deeply concerning contradictions in the early accounts of that day. None of that involvement is evidence of what happened to Nolan. It's evidence of how much a case built on documented gaps and inconsistent transparency can come to represent something much larger than one boat trip. Funeral services for Nolan drew significant public attention on their own, held, at the family's request, at a venue large enough to accommodate the size of the community response, a detail that on its own tells you how far this had already traveled beyond Ocean Springs by the time his family buried him. That's the paradox sitting at the center of this entire case. The same national attention that's helped keep pressure on investigators to actually finish this case has also, by the family's own account, made it harder for anyone connected to it to simply grieve. Which brings us to the question sitting underneath everything else. Why is there a grand jury at all, if, as officials have said more than once, no evidence of foul play has been identified? District Attorney Angel Myers-McElrath has stated that once the investigation concludes, she'll let a Jackson County grand jury decide whether any charges are warranted. A grand jury doesn't require proof that a crime happened. It's a mechanism for reviewing evidence and deciding whether prosecution is warranted, which means its existence here doesn't confirm foul play any more than its absence would confirm an accident. But it does confirm something. This is being treated, procedurally, with the seriousness of a case where the manner of death is still genuinely unresolved, not a routine drowning being wrapped up on schedule. McIlrath's office has said its near-total public silence is deliberate, an ethical obligation, in her words, to avoid public statements that could influence witnesses or compromise the fairness of the grand jury process. In a video statement in late July, she said directly that her restraint in discussing facts and evidence is not an effort to keep the truth from the public, but an effort to protect the integrity of the investigation and the eventual grand jury proceeding. That's a legitimate legal principle, and prosecutors are bound by real ethical rules about litigating cases in public before a jury has ever heard them. But it's also, functionally, indistinguishable from stonewalling to a family and a community that have been asking the same basic questions for 6 weeks and getting almost nothing back. A former county prosecutor with 3 decades of criminal trial experience made a version of this exact point publicly this week, drawing a distinction worth repeating in plain terms. There's a real difference between compromising an active investigation and simply confirming or correcting a factual claim about a scheduling agreement. Declining to discuss evidence or theories is defensible. Staying silent when a family's attorney sends a formal letter describing a specific agreement and not confirming or denying whether that agreement is accurate is a different thing entirely, and it's the kind of silence that manufactures distrust, independent of whether the underlying investigation is actually being handled properly. Both halves of that tension are true simultaneously, and it's arguably the real engine driving this entire case's second life online. It's worth pausing on why a single boating death on a small island in Mississippi became one of the most discussed criminal-adjacent stories in the country this summer, because that's a story in itself, and it says something about where true crime coverage is right now. 6 weeks with no cause of death, a sealed autopsy, and an 18-year-old football player who happened to be the only black kid in a group of white friends is, unfortunately, close to a perfect storm for the current media environment. Amateur online investigators, some genuinely trying to help, combing through public records and old social media posts for real inconsistencies, descended on this case within days. So did people with no interest in accuracy at all, just an audience to build. Both groups use the same tools now: screen recordings, side-by-side timeline graphics, dramatic narration. From the outside, confirmed reporting and unverified speculation can look identical, delivered in the same tone of voice, with the same production value. That's not a criticism of the people asking real questions. Some of the gaps this case has genuinely produced, like the missing return footage and the sealed autopsy, are legitimate, and they exist because official channels have been slow to address them, not because anyone invented them. But it does mean the burden on anyone covering this responsibly is higher than it would have been 10 years ago, when a case like this stayed contained to local newspapers and a courtroom. Now it's contained to nothing. It reaches the people it's about faster than it reaches any correction. We're going to keep following the actual case filings on this one as they come out, not just the headlines built around them. So if you want the next update, the moment there's something real to report, subscribe and turn on notifications. Before we close tonight, there's something we need to be direct with you about. You've probably seen other coverage of this case, a lot of it, naming specific friends who were on that boat trip, laying out theories about what they supposedly did or didn't do, treating rhetorical questions as though they were answers. We're not going to do that here, and we want to tell you exactly why, because it's not caution for its own sake. None of Nolan's friends from that trip have been charged with anything. Investigators have interviewed them, along with roughly 60 other witnesses, and as of this recording, no arrest has been made, and no crime has been publicly confirmed. At the same time, CNN has reported that some of the people connected to this case, including friends who were on that boat, have already received death threats and harassment fueled by exactly the kind of speculation that spread online since July. That's not a hypothetical risk. It's already happening to real people based on theories that haven't been substantiated by anyone with actual authority over this case. We think a responsible account of this story means being honest about what's confirmed and what isn't, and it means not adding fuel to something that's already put real people in danger, guilty or not. So where does this leave us? 6 weeks after Nolan Wells should have just been getting back into the rhythm of another football season. Here's what's actually confirmed. Nolan went to Horn Island with friends on July 4th and was last seen there around 3 p.m. His friend's account is that he chose to stay behind. His mother has said publicly, that's not like him. His body was found 2 days later, close to where he was last seen. 2 separate autopsies, one state, one independent, have both failed to determine his cause of death. A grand jury has been convened, though no crime has been announced. His parents and the district attorney remain in an unresolved standoff over the joint forensic examination of his phone that both sides agreed to back in July, but still haven't carried out. No return footage of the boats has surfaced publicly. No charges have been filed against anyone. Here's what's still genuinely unknown. How Nolan actually died, why the state's autopsy remains sealed, whether the phone examination both sides say they want will actually happen, and what it will show if it does, and whether the questions driving this case forward are the sound of a real injustice waiting to surface, or the sound of a genuinely accidental tragedy getting swallowed by a moment in this country, primed to expect the worst. Right now, honestly, nobody outside that investigation knows which. What we do know is that on August 19th, Nolan Wells should have turned 19. Instead, his mother marked the day writing a message to her son in heaven instead of planning him a birthday. Whatever the phone shows, whatever the sealed autopsy eventually says, whatever a grand jury ultimately decides, none of it changes the fact that a young man who, by every account, spent his short life making other people feel less alone, ended his final hours alone on an island, and it took his community, his family, and now millions of strangers watching from home, demanding an answer his own government still hasn't given him. There's a version of this story that ends up being a straightforward, devastating accident, a strong swimmer, a chaotic holiday crowd, a series of small decisions that added up to a tragedy nobody caused on purpose. There's another version where the gaps that have opened up over 6 weeks turn out to mean exactly what the family fears they mean. Right now, both of those versions are still technically possible, and anyone telling you with total certainty which one is true, in either direction, is telling you more than the actual evidence currently supports. That includes us. Our job tonight wasn't to hand you a verdict, it was to make sure you had the real record, not someone's performance of having it. What isn't in question is what Nolan's family is owed, and what they still don't have: a completed toxicology report made public, an unsealed autopsy, a forensic phone examination actually carried out the way both sides agreed to back in July, and a straight answer from the one office in Jackson County with the authority to give one. Until that happens, the questions aren't going away, and honestly, they shouldn't. We'll keep following this one as it develops. If you have information relevant to this case, Jackson County investigators are still asking for it directly. For everyone else, we'll be back the moment there's something real to report.